This is James Spencer from Spencer Music and Artist Development. This course is the history of film music for London College of Music. And these little episodes are going to be overviews of various famous composers that we will be looking at in the class. This is also up on YouTube for those that might be interested in specific composers. So today we're going to look at one of my favorite composers, Max Steiner. Maximilian Raoul Steiner was born May 10th, 1888 in Vienna, Austria. He later died December 28th, 1971 in Hollywood, California. He was a child prodigy who conducted his first operetta at the age of 12 and had a full-blown professional career as a composer, arranger, and conductor already by age 15. Steiner worked in England, then Broadway, and then in 1929 he moved to Hollywood, where he would have a very prolific period of scoring for some of the most famous movies of all time. And Steiner enters the tradition of writing music as other famous composers at that time, which would include other people we're going to talk about in this class. And that would be people like Dmitri Tiomkin, Franz Waxman, Erich Wolfgang Korngold, Alfred Newman, Bernard Herrmann, and Miklos Rozsa. In his career, Max Steiner composed over 300 films for specifically these two studios, RKO Pictures and Warner Brothers. He was nominated for 24 Academy Awards, winning 3 Best Oscars for The Informer, 1935, Now Voyager, one of my favorites with Bette Davis, 1942, and Since You Went Away, 1944. Besides his Oscar-winning scores, Steiner scored several popular works in American culture. Some of his scores include King Kong, 1933, Little Women, 1933, Jezebel with Bette Davis, 1938, one of the most famous movies of all time, Casablanca, 1942, The Searchers, 1956, and A Summer Place, 1959. His most famous score that we associate with Max Steiner is, of course, Gone with the Wind, 1939. He also received the Golden Globe Award, actually the very first Golden Globe Award for Best Original Score for the work Life with Father. And he frequently collaborated with many famous directors and, of course, many famous actors and actresses. So now let's take a look at his early years, his childhood. Steiner, again, was born May 10th, 1888 in Austria, and he was the only child of a very wealthy and theatrical family of Jewish heritage. He was named after his paternal grandfather, Maximilian Steiner, who was credited with first persuading the composer Johann Strauss to write for the theater, and was influentially the manager of the Viennese historical Theater an der Wien, the Viennese theater. Okay, and for those who might forget, Johann Strauss was the Waltz King. He was the famous composer who wrote the Blue Danube, but also wrote the most famous operetta, Die Fledermaus. Okay, so Max Steiner gets from his grandfather, starts learning about operetta. And it's interesting to also note that Max Steiner's actual godfather was the composer Richard Strauss, one of the most famous composers in the 20th century. When he was young, his parents sent Max Steiner to the Vienna University of Technology, but he expressed obviously that he didn't care for, business and technical. He wanted to go into music. So he enrolled in 1904 in the Imperial Academy of Music. And he was a bit precocious, and one of his private tutors was both Robert Fuchs and the most famous composer of the day, Gustav Mahler. And he completed a 4-year course for college in only 1 year and studied all of the following: piano, organ, violin, bass, trumpet, oh, excuse me, harmony, counterpoint, and composition. He received many prestigious awards, including all kinds of gold medals from that school very early on. So, like I said, in his early years, Max Steiner was a virtuoso. He was a prodigy. Beginning his early career, Steiner first entered the professional world at age 15, where he wrote and conducted his first operetta, which was called The Beautiful Greek Girl. And the opera did very well, running in many cities, including making it all the way to Moscow. He then was invited into London to conduct Lehar's famous operetta, The Merry Widow. And he stayed in London conducting there for many of the famous operetta houses, including the Adelphi, the Hippodrome, the London Pavilion, and the Blackpool Winter Gardens. In England, Steiner wrote and conducted theater productions as well as wrote his own symphonies. But in 1914, World War I started, and he was interned as an enemy alien. And so, luckily, what happened is the Duke of Westminster befriended him and kept him out of, the detainment camps, and got him exit papers to move to America. Although what happened is his money was impounded. So it took a little while, and literally with only $32 to his whole name, he was able to finally get into New York and get out of Europe during World War I. So it was a pretty scary story. But that brings him to Broadway, and this opens up a lot of new opportunities for Steiner. So Steiner soon acquires employment in New York, where he stayed for almost 15 years as a music director, arranger, orchestrator, and conductor of Broadway musicals, operettas, and so forth. And he actually conducted works by many famous American composers, including Victor Herbert, Jerome Kern, Vincent Newman, and even George Gershwin, working as the conductor on 2 really big Gershwin works, the George White Scandals, and then Lady Be Good. And he worked as conductor and orchestrator of those works. So that's pretty amazing that he just fell in right away on Broadway with some of the greatest composers of the day, of the 1920s. Steiner in 1927 comes to Hollywood, and this starts to begin his famous career as a film composer. And the one piece that brings him over is a movie called Rio Rita, which was for RKO in 1927, and he comes over to be the orchestrator and conductor of that score. Okay, now we get to Hollywood. In the early 30s, Steiner accepts a contract from RKO to become, a featured film composer for that studio. And after Rio Rita and another smaller work called Dixiana, he does his first major score, which was called the Symphony of 6 Million, which was in 1932 for, of course, David O. Selznick. And Steiner composed a short segment for Selznick that he liked so much that, he started to put his music into the movies. And so that underscoring for Symphony of 6 Million really starts to get Steiner going in Hollywood. Okay, so now we get to 1933 and his first big score that we want to take notice of, and that is King Kong, which became, you know, the epic horror movie. And this is a breakthrough score for, you know, for Steiner. And the studio bosses were initially skeptical about even having a score for King Kong, since they disliked the film's contrived special effects that they were developing at the time. So they thought a musical score might, you know, overpower the horror in King Kong. But, you know, what happened is the producer of King Kong, Marion Cooper, really liked Steiner's score and left it in, and of course it really sets the tone for that movie. And the film quickly really establishes RKO as a great studio and Steiner as a great composer. And he goes on to score for RKO, oh my gosh, like I think about another 55 movies, including some very important ones, one being Of Human Bondage, which starred Leslie Howard and Bette Davis, and that was 1934. And another movie for John Ford, the director, called The Lost Patrol. In 1935, John Ford hired Steiner to write the music for The Informer, and the film was nominated for 6 Academy Awards, including Steiner's for Best Score. Okay, let's move ahead. So now, around the late 30s, Steiner also gets asked to compose for Warner Brothers. And he moves over to Warner Brothers for a while, and he scores The Charge of the Light Brigade, 1936, and also does another 140 films for Warner Brothers. Okay, so let's now skip ahead to, you know, what is considered his most famous score, and that would be Gone with the Wind, 1939. And in 1939, Stein was borrowed from Warner Brothers by David O. Selznick to compose Gone with the Wind, which became one of Steiner's most notable successes. Steiner was the only composer Selznick even considered to write Gone with the Wind. And Steiner was given only 3 months to complete the whole score for Gone with the Wind. And as you know, Gone with the Wind is an epic movie. And this led to literally Steiner working day and night to complete the score. And the composition consisted of 16 main themes as well as over 300 musical segments. And due to this, Steiner worked literally 20-hour days to complete this, even being administered Benzedrine by a doctor to stay awake. So it became almost a dangerous affair for Steiner working on that score, because he literally, you know, worked himself into the ground. And Steiner, you know, had to work with pre-existing scenes that were specific lengths, and Steiner kind of ignored Selznick's wishes to just use all the traditional Civil War themes to compose an actual new score. Now, in Gone with the Wind, Max Steiner does quote a few Civil War pieces like Dixie, but overall it's a completely original score, okay? And the score worked so well, it established Gone with the Wind as, you know, ranking as number 2 as, you know, number 2 movie of all time. So that's pretty amazing. So that score is a must to look at for those in this class, to look at Max Steiner's score for that. Alas, Gone with the Wind came out the same year as The Wizard of Oz, which had a musical score by the composer Harold Arlen and lyrics by Yip Harburg. And that was the score that won for best, musical score of that year. So, that was unfortunate because Steiner really should have received an Oscar for Gone with the Wind. We already talked about some other nominated scores for Oscars, like The Letter, 1940, Sergeant York, 41, Casablanca, 42, now Voyager, 42. Off genre, Max Steiner did score a few Western movies that are worth looking at. One is Dodge City, 1939, Oklahoma Kid, 1939, and The Adventures of Mark Twain, 1944. And They Died with Their Boots, 1941, and The Searchers, 1956. His most notable later work was A Summer Place, and the theme to A Summer Place became a big pop hit of the 1950s, mostly noted to be orchestrated in a cover version by Percy Faith. So that's a work that you would want to know. A little bit about his method of composing. Steiner explained that in early days of sound, producers avoided underscoring music behind dialogue, feeling that the audience would wonder where the music was coming from. As a result, he noted that they began to add a little music here and there to support love scenes or silent sequences. But in scenes where music might be expected, such as a nightclub, ballroom, or theater, the orchestra fit in more naturally and was used more often. However, because half of the music was recorded on the set, Steiner said it led to a great deal of inconvenience and cost when scenes were later edited, because the scores would often be ruined. As recording technology improved during this period, he was able to record the music and sync it to the film and can change the score after the film was edited. Steiner explained his own typical method of scoring this way. So this is Steiner's words. When a picture is finished and finally edited, it is turned over to me. Then I time it, not by a stopwatch, however, as many do. I have the film put through a special measuring machine, and then a cue sheet created which gives me the exact time to a split second in which an action takes place or a word is spoken. While these cues sheets are being made, I begin to work on the themes for the different characters and scenes, but without regard for the required time. During this period, I also digest what I have seen and try to plan the music for this picture. There may be scenes that is played a shade too slow or a shade too fast, and then I can adjust that at a later time. Perhaps the music can clarify a character's emotions, such as intense suffering or romantic longing. Steiner often followed his instincts in his own reasoning in creating film scores. For example, the sweeping theme we hear as the main theme for Gone with the Wind, and so forth. So there's a little bit of about Steiner. Steiner loved to think also in terms of the character development and how the music would affect the feeling we get from a character. For example, he did a score for Tennessee Williams' The Glass Menagerie, 1950. And for the physically crippled heroine Laura, Steiner had wanted to capture the vulnerability of her fragileness, but also her obsession with this delicate little glass pieces. And so the music actually does have a glassy quality. He uses things like vibraphone, celeste, and triangle to get this kind of glassy, icy effect that reflects not only the scene with the menagerie, but also the character of Laura. So these are kind of things that, we hear in Steiner is using themes that reflect a character. For example, Laura's brother in that movie is sort of a soldier, kind of big, macho guy type. And so then Steiner uses sort of this bluesy, burlesque music that is more good-hearted and good-natured and a little sexy for Laura's brother. So we see these contrasts in the musical scoring for characters, and that's something Matt Steiner was known for. We also see underscoring for specific scenes. Like, here's some examples. In King Kong, King Kong is in love with Fay Wray's character, and we see through the music this idea of both terrorism of the King Kong character, but also tenderness, and the music kind of draws us into both of that. For example, in the murder scene at the beginning of the movie The Letter with Bette Davis, we see the music crescendo to, a pitch at the murder. These are just different things we see in music. In, for example, The Big Sleep, which is a movie he scored, which is, of course, the vehicle for Bogart and Bacall. We get sort of a claustrophobic feeling in that, and we have dense strings and a lot of brass for that movie, for example. So these are just kind of things that Steiner was known for. Okay, a little bit about his personal life. Max Steiner married a couple of times. He married Audrey von Lew, April 27, 1927, but they divorced in December of 1933. Then he married the concert harpist Louise Kloss in 1936, and they had a son named Ron, but they divorced in 1946. In 1947, Max married Lynette Blair, and by the way, then Ron died in 1962, and Max Steiner died of congestive heart failure in Hollywood at age 83. And Max Steiner, for those that are interested, is buried at Forest Lawn in Glendale, California. Okay, great. So there's just a little bit of background on Max Steiner. For those in my film course here, what you're going to want to do is watch, as you start this class, at least 2, if not 3, films by every composer I'm lecturing on. So I will expect students for Max Steiner here to look at specifically Gone with the Wind needs to be one of them, and the other 2 I would suggest would be King Kong and maybe one of the Bette Davis movies like Now Voyager would be a good one to look at. Okay, thank you for joining us. This is James Spencer for History of Film Scores LCM. Thanks again.